Welcome to the Byland Clinic podcast, where we discuss the intersection between psychology, neuropsychology, and education. I'm Dr. James Byland, owner and director of the Byland Clinic.
I'm Danielle Morales. I'm a licensed educational psychologist and the co-director. And today we are going to be talking about dyscalculia, so math learning disability. And I know, James, that you've been presenting on this topic lately. So we
Yeah.
wanted to go ahead and record an episode to kind of build on that momentum and all of your recent work and notes. And so I think this is a really good topic as we were chatting about before recording. Less is known about math learning disabilities than, the literacy-based learning disorders, right? So
For
I think at
sure.
this point, dyslexia and, writing disabilities like dysgraphia even have really started to enter into more common discourse, meaning, schools are talking about them, more parents are talking about them. There's an awareness, that those disabilities exist and even understanding of how they show up in terms of the reading and different writing systems.
Yeah.
However, right, math, I think for a long time and still to some degree is kind of framed as another, right? Of, people saying, oh, I don't like math, I'm no good at math. And it's, I think, a little bit more accepted that to avoid it in some ways. So
Sure.
it's a pretty layered topic. I think there's a little less public awareness of it. So, I'm excited to dive in and hear your recent research and work on it.
Yeah.
To get started, I think, can you talk through what are the different neurocognitive and academic systems that are impacted by dyscalculia? So it's not a monolith, right?
No.
What are the different ways it shows up? Are there subtypes like there are with dyslexia or dysgraphia?
Yeah. No, excellent question. And in a lot of ways, I mean, you talked earlier about there's a lot of discussion right now around dyslexia, how to assess for dyslexia, how to treat dyslexia, and not so much in math. And recently I was giving a presentation on learning disabilities, sort of generally, and that was actually one of the specific things. One of the participants, this was a group of teachers, came up and asked me, she's like, "Are we going to talk about math?" She's like, "I've been to all kinds of presentations on reading. I know how to." Work with kids that have reading disabilities, but I don't know what to do with math, and no one's ever talking about math, right? And so, kind of going to your point, I think one of the other factors there is assessing reading is pretty straightforward. There's sort of three areas of processing that we know are directly linked to reading development. There's been a ton of research done over the last 25 years in terms of how to treat dyslexia. So we know very clearly how to identify it and how to treat it. And one, like you said, math just hasn't gotten the same level of attention, probably for a variety of different reasons. But assessing it is also a lot more complex. Um, you know, our, our uh, our brain possesses the structure to learn math, right? We're not born doing math, right? Like we're not, we need to be taught how to do math. It's not something that we just do intuitively through, observation, or like we learn language when we're younger or something like that, or we learn how to walk, right? We don't learn math without instruction. Our brain has the hardware in order to be able to do it, but there's a lot of different neural networks involved, right? So it's not as isolated as, say, learning how to read is, as far from like a neuropsychological perspective. There's a lot of different areas of processing involved in it. And sometimes it's helpful to think, I suppose, in terms of like subtypes. I don't want to get too bogged down on the subtype, sort of as if, there's four different, types of math learning disabilities, and you only fall into one of those four camps, right? Because all these different neural networks involved in doing math are all interconnected and working together. So it's hard to isolate it down to a single area of processing. Oftentimes, there's multiple areas of processing impacting math. I think the first thing that comes to mind when we think about math learning disabilities is just sort of our intuitive number sense, right? And this is really the foundation for math, right? Is just our understanding of quantity and the relationships between numbers. And there actually is a part of our brain, the in a right parietal lobe, the interparietal sulcus, that is sort of like our internal number line. And here's where we sort of understand again quantities and relationships between numbers. And even very young children, before they have a language for math, right? They understand more and less, right? We have sort of this kind of rough estimation system that's sort of built into our brain. So, a young child that doesn't know how to count yet, if I give them a plate of 5 cookies and a plate of 2 cookies and said, you can pick whichever one you want, they're going to pick the one with the 5 cookies because they just intuitively understand that 5 is more than 2, right? And so this is really sort of the foundation for learning math is this understanding about the relationships between numbers and quantity. And some kids struggle with math because they really struggle with number sense, right? And from a neuropsychological perspective, there's different tests that we can give that, assess a child's number sense. It's also closely tied to what they call visual-spatial processing. It's the same area of our brain that has that intuitive sense of quantity and distance is the same part of our brain that processes, spatial relationships, right? So again, sort of one, we've got number sense, but kids can have really good number sense and still struggle with math for completely separate reasons, right? So you think about things like working memory, right? So just our ability to manage multiple pieces of information in order to be able to execute a task, not just math, any task, right? And so here we can have a kid that has really pretty good number sense, but as soon as math problems become multi-step, they begin to struggle to remember and sequence those steps without forgetting a step or doing things in the wrong order because of working memory difficulties. And this isn't due to a lack of number sense. It's an issue with execution, right? They understand the concepts, but they can't execute the operations on paper because of poor working memory. There's other, think of working memory as, executive functioning is a word that gets thrown around a lot. Of working memory is a core executive function, but there's other executive functions, right? Like when I'm approaching a math problem, be able to plan out the steps needed, be able to select an appropriate strategy, being able to self-monitor and notice and fix when I make mistakes. If a strategy isn't working, do I have the cognitive flexibility to now think of different strategies and approaches to solving the problem, right? So here's just more areas of executive functioning that can impact math development, um, you know, even with good number sense. Working memory or other executive functions can impact math development, even when we've got solid number sense.
Hmm.
But there's even more areas of processing, right? Like language, for example. So kids who have language-based learning disabilities often struggle when they're younger just learning, memorizing basic arithmetic facts, right? Like, we memorize 2 + 2 = 4 the same way that we might memorize Jack and Jill walk up a hill, right? Like it's just a language script that we memorize and can quickly recall on demand. But then language processing difficulties can certainly go beyond that, right? So a kid might be struggling with math word problems because they struggle with number sense and understanding what the question is asking, but they also might just be struggling comprehending the language of the question, right? And understanding what certain math phrases mean and what operation they need to execute as a result of that, right? So
Hmm.
again, we got number sense, we have executive functioning, we have language. I mentioned visual spatial processing and the relationship between that and number sense, but it can also affect things like my ability to line numbers up on a page when I'm performing operations. It can affect my ability to interpret charts and graphs. It can certainly affect my ability to learn geometry because I'm having a hard time creating and orienting images in space in my mind.
Hmm.
So again, we can think of those as different subtypes of math learning disability. I think at the end of the day, what we really need to do, though, is really do a thorough assessment to understand each individual's unique profile, and not just identify that they're having difficulty in math. And this is where a neuropsychological evaluation is really helpful. It doesn't tell us just that, oh, they're below average in math, right? It helps us understand what the uh, areas of processing that they're struggling with that may be impacting that lower score in math. And that's really the basis for all of the intervention, right? Because I could have two children with an identical math score on a standardized test. They both perform within the below average range. And each of those kids i- is having difficulty for completely different reasons, right? And
Hmm.
and then our interventions then need to be tailored to the areas of processing that are really impacting their development in math. So um, I guess again to this idea of subtypes, certainly there's kids that struggle with math for different reasons, but each child is unique, and it could be one or any combination of those that are getting in the way of their development in math.
I appreciate the overview of the neuropsychology. I mean, I think one of the things that I've always kept in mind in thinking about math learning disabilities is that, as you mentioned, it's a more innate process, right? So reading is something that humans as a species created, to have a written correspondence way to keep records and,
Yeah,
communicate. But math, as you mentioned, it's something intuitive. Like we are born kind of having a basic understanding of like what tree has more fruit in it, what we
yeah,
need structurally to build a hut, right? And I
right,
remember reading that we actually are able to do these very complex physics problems in our mind of knowing how much time, for example, you have to pull out in an intersection that you don't get hit with a car. So we're kind of like
right, exactly,
running these internal, really complex and invisible scripts
right,
that are, kind of this innate math reasoning. And I like you talking through all the different prongs and different angles of which it can be compromised to really illustrate how layered math learning disabilities assessment are and
yeah,
why you can't really go in with as clean of a scalpel as you can with something like dyslexia. And I
right,
know we've talked about dysgraphia is similar to math learning disabilities where there's so many inputs that can be compromised.
yeah.
And so, to add another layer of complexity to all of this, math anxiety, right? So I think that's one of the
Yeah,
big areas that is tricky with differential diagnosis. Math in particular has a storied history of bringing up really specific emotions in people, particularly women and
yeah,
girls and people of color. And, there's lots of studies showing that, a big part of lower performance is psychological in math, meaning somebody's
yeah,
coming in saying, I'm not good at math, or somebody who looks like me is not good at math.
yeah,
And that's actually impacting their scores
yeah,
and kind of masquerading as a disability in learning, whereas it is actually more related to your self-esteem, your socio-emotional concept.
yeah,
And then, of course, it can also be bidirectional, right? If you do genuinely have trouble with processing, some of those areas, the neuropsychological areas you're talking about, and you have a learning disability in math, a very logical reaction is to be anxious about it and avoid it. So when you have that, coming in as a referral question, right? Is
yeah.
this causally rooted in anxiety or a math learning disability? What does that testing process look like? And what are the key things that we're looking for?
Yeah. I just sort of pause for a second, right? 'Cause I think a lot of us can think back to our third grade 1 minute timed math test and
Mm.
probably
Oh my
there's a
gosh.
fair amount
I
of stress and
I that was
anxiety
the one
from,
time I had a test crumpled up in front of me because I fr was freaking out and trying to finish
oh
it and I
God.
just broke down in tears. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Pretty
very
shared
specific memory.
Yeah, pretty shared experience, I think, for a
Yes.
lot of for a lot of people. And you're right. I mean, we see a lot of overlap between math learning disability and anxiety, right? Probably more so than we even see with other learning disabilities. Although I would say, sort of generally speaking, kids with learning disabilities do experience elevated stress response in school, right? I
Hmm.
mean, interesting studies, even when kids are out on the basketball court and they're fine, and then they're measuring their skin conductance and heart rate as they move closer and closer to the classroom and seeing their stress levels elevate, just kind of across the board for kids with learning disabilities. But
Hmm.
I agree. I think with math, it's much more common of a problem, right? And I mean, if you think about it, right, when kids that have, well, let me take a step back, right? Like math learning disabilities are neurodevelopmental disorders, right? They're rooted in various areas of processing that we already talked about. Stress and anxiety is a physiological and emotional response, right? And so, a lot of kids that have math learning disabilities, every time they don't finish a math worksheet on time, or they get a bad grade on it, or they struggle on a test, over time, they just begin to anticipate a negative result, from, when they're presented with having to do math, right? And that does create a lot of anxiety. I think, and you kind of touched on this earlier too, in terms of this downward spiral, because one of the added factors, right, is not just the discomfort of feeling stress and anxiety, but elevated stress actually shuts down some of the key areas of processing that are necessary in order to do math, right? So It can impact our ability to focus our attention. It has a tremendous impact on working memory capacity, which we've talked about. It affects long-term storage and retrieval of information. So now I'm having a hard time remembering, whether it's math facts or procedures for series of operations to complete an equation, right? Uh, so now we have the math learning disability, we have the stress and anxiety resulting from our history of math difficulties, and now that stress and anxiety is further compromising the areas of processing that we need in order to be able to do the math, right? So it's pretty much a downward spiral from there. Certainly the reverse could be true, right? Like I could have somebody who maybe has an anxiety disorder, and then they really struggle in situations like taking a math test or something like that, just because of this sort of general anxiety that they experience, either general anxiety or maybe like performance anxiety or something like that, right? So it's a really important thing to tease apart in our assessment. Because if the anxiety is rooted in the math learning disability, of course, we want to treat the math learning disability, and hopefully that has some benefit in terms of reducing the amount of anxiety. If it's primarily anxiety, of course, we want to treat the anxiety, whether cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, whatever the methodology might um, whatever methodology may be called for that particular person, right? And then if we would hope to then see improvement on, say, like math tests or things like that. And for some, it's both, right? And we need to treat both of those simultaneously. And I think you sort of asked about, how do we tease those things apart in our neuropsych assessment? And we do that through a comprehensive battery of different tests, looking at all of these things in isolation, right? And so we're looking at, I mentioned earlier, all of the areas of processing related to math, seeing whether or not all those areas of processing are intact. We're looking at their math achievement, and hopefully in an environment where they feel less overwhelmed and stressed while they're completing the test. And then we're also assessing for anxiety. I think anytime we're taking a look at a math learning disability, we have to assess for anxiety to see whether or not, again, either is it the primary factor or is it just a compounding factor on their math learning disability. And by looking at all those things in isolation, we can sort of tease them apart a bit, right? And so, if we see that child's coming in and, all these areas of processing we took a look at are intact, when we, assess these skills in isolation, they demonstrated the skills, right? But then our assessment also shows this is a young person who's experiencing high levels of performance anxiety, right? And so, they have the intuitive number sense, they've got the working memory capacity, in a stress-free environment, they're able to recall and execute procedures. But they get into school and they're burdened by this overwhelming stress that they're experiencing. Versus, when we go through the assessment and we're identifying areas of processing that impact math, and we're seeing the underachievement in math, and then seeing whether or not that's also coupled with anxiety. And like I said earlier, then by identifying, what sort of the root cause of all of this is, then we know how to approach the problem and how to treat it. And I think we'll probably talk about interventions at some point here too. But I think an important part of the interventions, certainly kids that have neurodevelopmental disabilities need really explicit, systematic instruction, right? Like it needs to be taught very explicitly. If they're having difficulties with number sense, we need to help them improve their number sense. If they have difficulties with working memory, we need to teach them strategies or implement accommodations that lessen the burden of the working memory load, for example. But at the end of the day, I think one of the most important things that we're doing is helping the kids feel confident in their ability to learn and do math, right? And um, so when we're treating it, with or without anxiety, I mean, we want kids to feel smart, we want them to feel capable, we want them to know that when they have the right instruction and accommodations and compensatory tools in place, that they're very capable, and so they approach math with more confidence, and in that way are more willing to engage in math instruction as well too, rather than experiencing this high stress response and shutting down.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me try to summarize that in my understanding in plain English, and talk through how I'm thinking through this. So typically, right, if we're not looking at LD, then when we're going in and doing that neuropsych battery, we're not seeing anything compromised in terms of those inputs, right? So when we're
Yeah,
removing math, for example, visual spatial processing, attention, all of these things looks fine. But
yeah,
a flag for it being more anxiety based is when there's attentional regulation issues specific in the context of math.
right.
Um, And then I think the other piece to kind of elevate and highlight is also if in our clinical observations we're seeing any sort of panic or anxiety-based response, either more
Sure.
generalized, diffuse across settings, or specific to math triggers. I know that when I'm testing kids with math anxiety, sometimes it is truly a panic response where they come in and they see the math and they'll start
Yeah, I've
having
definitely
like
seen that.
rapid breathing and a panic attack. And I've had kids where exposure therapy is literally having, math facts written on the board. We're looking at the different inputs to see if they're compromised with the
Right.
academics.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes you see that really clearly in the testing session. I
Yeah.
am thinking of a young woman who was in her sophomore year of college with a math learning disability. She had a math learning disability and a lot of anxiety around math. So in that case, it was both. And I remember her just completely shutting down, when presented with math problems on a page. Certainly, there's also instances where, in our sessions, they're able to demonstrate adequate math scores, right? Like good math computation, good math reasoning, good math problem solving. And then they get in school and they're just unable to execute, say, like in a testing environment where they're sitting down and doing a test in class. And so there, not only are the areas of processing intact, but we can see through our testing that their skills are actually adequately developed, right? But
Mhm.
again, that, at the output phase, because of the stress and anxiety, they're just unable to perform.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't want to belabor this point too much because I know we have lots of other content to get to, but I think that this conversation also really highlights why assessment is so important. I know these days there's so much self-advocacy and research online, and it's so important that people are, becoming more knowledge and educated and self-aware on these things. And I think this conversation helps delineate how many layers there can be.
Yeah.
And why it's good to get a professional assessment instead of kind of
Yeah.
assuming I'm bad at math. I think, therefore, that means I have a learning disability in that area.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, another area to touch on is that learning disabilities do have a pretty high co-occurring rate, right? So they do tend to kind of travel together.
Yeah.
I think it's upwards of 50% of kids with dyslexia also have dyscalculia.
Yeah.
And I know that's because, as we were talking about, right, those neuropsychological processes, if one is impacted, it very likely will show up in another academic domain. So, for example, as you were giving the example of if you have issues working memory, that may not only impact your ability to keep in mind key parts of the word problem as you're solving it or keep your place in a multi-digit computation, but also remember, what you're trying to keep in mind when you're writing an essay, right? What is the
Absolutely.
claim? What are my evidence? What did I talk about? What is my evidence? What did I talk about? What have I not talked about already? Did I edit this? So this adds layers of complexity, right? So given that learning disabilities often do co-occur, how does this impact assessment? How does this impact treatment? And I think, just to add another layer of complexity for you, IEPs and IEP goals.
Oh gosh. Let's talk about co-occurrence, and then maybe we can come back around to the
Mhm.
IEP part of it. Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I've been, assessing, trying to think of what year it is here, right? So I've been assessing learning disabilities for 20 years. I've 20 years of experience. I can tell you definitively that co-occurrence is more the rule than exception when it comes to assessing,
Mhm.
neurodevelopmental disabilities. Uh, for the very reason you mentioned, right? So, these areas of how our brain processes information is not isolated to a few exceptions, right? And as I'm sort of talking through this, but for the most part, these areas like visual spatial processing, reasoning, memory, working memory, attention, executive function, motor control, these aren't things that we just use for reading or math, right? I mean, these are, areas of processing that we're tapping into to perform a wide range of different things, right? And so, for example, with math learning disabilities, if your math learning disability is rooted in difficulties with attention, working memory, and executive functioning, you may very well also meet diagnostic criteria for ADHD, for example. If you have a language-based learning disability, that can affect reading, writing, and math, right? And so, a lot of these areas of processing, like you said, are important, across academic domains, right? And so we oftentimes see this co-occurrence. In terms of our assessment, it is, well, I guess one, it's helpful to get a comprehensive assessment, right? Because if we came into the office, for example, and they're only having difficulty with math, and say we were only, gave a math achievement test, for example, I could tell you, yes, they've got, they're scoring in the below average range in terms of their math achievement. But one, like I said earlier, that doesn't tell us why. And then it also means we may be missing something, right? So say, for example, somebody has, a math learning disability and ADHD, and we're just treating the math learning disability without treating the ADHD, we're not going to see the type of progress that we would see if we were treating both, right? If somebody's having, difficulties with math word problems and we're attributing that solely to poor math reasoning, but we're not looking at their ability to process and comprehend language, or we're not looking at their working memory capacity or things like that, then we're not, one, going to be able to treat it, properly, but there may be other factors, right? Like they're struggling with maybe their difficulties with word problems is because of difficulties with word reading, fluency, and comprehension of text, right? And so it is really important that we're doing a comprehensive evaluation. If there's co-occurring disorders, that we're identifying those so that we're treating it properly, and then also, that our interventions are targeting the right thing, right? So. Again, are the difficulties with math solely due to ADHD? And if we treat the ADHD, we're going to see increased production and execution and better achievement in math, or is there, ADHD plus a math learning disability, in which case it's really important that we're treating both in order to see the improvement that you know that we're that we're hoping for.
And so there's not diagnostic overshadowing too, right? And so we're not attributing everything, like you said, to the one disability. I think
Right.
that's one of the issues that I commonly encounter, doing IEE work is there'll be multiple layers and the assessment stops at layer one.
Yeah.
So if there is ADHD, then for example, and I love that example because, again, the executive skills that are so inherent in math are also compromised in ADHD.
Yeah.
And so what you'll see in kind of more surface level psychoeducational evaluations sometimes is, oh, it looks like they have ADHD because it may not even be diagnosed, right, in a school-facing
Yeah.
assessment, but it'll say it looks like this is ADHD, therefore the math is impacted because of that. And it's kind of that's it, right? But then the classroom
Yeah. I see that all
interventions
the
may
time.
all be accommodations for attention, right? But then not addressing the specific executive or attention skills that need to be targeted with dyscalculia, right? In
Yeah.
terms of, and I think that there's where the devil is in the details of, and where the danger is. I think one of the ways I explain it to parents, if they've heard before that, everything is attributed to kind of like a primary diagnosis and, the other ones are not fleshed out, like dyscalculia, which is very common that dyscalculia is for some reason not listed or
Yeah.
thoroughly assessed, particularly in the school-based assessments, even if it's like clearly an area that's impacted, um, is, it's really silly to say the inverse, right? To say, well, everybody with ADHD has issues with math, right? Like
Right.
that's clearly false. And so I kind of will use that analogy sometimes to explain why it's important also to delineate, yeah, a lot of the neuropsych processes that are impacting the ADHD, of course, that's what's underpinning the math, but we need that to be a separate line so that the treatment is clear and it's clear that for this individual, that's a way that ADHD is showing up.
No, absolutely. And you see that a lot in schools where they'll just sort of attribute everything to ADHD, right? So a kid comes in with a diagnosis, or maybe through their assessment they got some elevated scales that show poor attention, and they want to attribute it all to that, right? And maybe do a 504 plan with accommodations, or, you know, urge the parents to put their child on medication or something like that. And while ignoring whether it's a math learning disability or something else that's going on. And like you said, I mean, they may be addressing part of the problem, but not all of it, and in some cases missing the problem altogether.
Yeah. And so I kind of building on that, what are things that parents should be on the lookout for in assessments that may signal they need a second opinion,
Yeah.
an IEE, a clinical assessment? What are some of the practical indicators that our parents can be on the lookout for when they're evaluating if a math assessment was comprehensive enough?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I always feel like I have to like pause for a moment and say like, there's a lot of wonderful people working in schools. There's a lot of wonderful school psychologists. Um, they're working within certain confines that we're not, right? They're limited in terms of their assessment tools, they're limited in terms of their time, they're limited in terms of what, their administration says they can say and do, right? So this isn't like a knock on anybody, currently working as a school psychologist. I applaud you for what you're doing. I used to do it myself, right? But that there are certain things that I think are really helpful for a parent to understand about the assessment and to take a look at, in the assessment and in the recommendations, and that then flows into the IEP that the school perhaps has developed and proposed, or not developed, and said that their child's not eligible for services, right? So that there's overlap between what we do and the school district does, right? The school district's going to give a battery of academic achievement tests, right? You come in for a test, session with us, we're going to give a battery of academic achievement tests. They're going to give an IQ test. We would very likely give an IQ test as well. So there's certainly overlap there. But kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, the school district, when they identify a learning disability, when they identify it, is pretty good at answering what, right? What is the area of disability, right? So is a specific learning disability in reading? Is it a specific learning disability in writing? Is it a specific learning disability in math? And that's pretty straightforward. They're looking at achievement test scores that are below a certain threshold to say, no, this is below average. This is a disability. What they don't do as good of a job as oftentimes, in my opinion, and because of some of those constraints that are placed on them, is oftentimes they don't explain why, right? And so, again, what I was saying earlier is just knowing that there's an underachievement in math isn't enough to provide effective intervention, right? We have to understand why is that, right? And so, some of the things as a parent, I might be looking for in the assessment report or asking the psychologist at the meeting is to say, hey, we see that they have this huge underachievement in math. What are the areas of processing that are contributing to that? Right? Taking a look at the recommendations in the report and maybe asking them, why did you make this recommendation? How is this recommendation tied to their underlying processing deficits? Right?
Mhm.
So, for example, if they say they've got a math learning disability and you're at the meeting and they say, well, it's probably because of these difficulties with working memory, then I'd want to look at the recommendations and have them explain, well, which one of these recommendations helps lighten the working memory load so that they can perform at a higher level, right? Or so that they can, learn math more efficiently. And trying to draw that connection between the underachievement, the area of processing, and the recommendations that were outlined in the report, or discussed in the meeting. I
Mhm.
think I think beyond the report, once we get to the point of identifying what it is, why is it occurring, and what we're then going to do about it, is also just talking to the IEP team too about progress monitoring. It's not enough to set, a handful of IEP goals, and say, oh, we're going to provide 120 minutes a week of intervention to support their math. We want to know how they're progressing in response to the intervention. Because if we're not doing regular progress monitoring, if the child's not making the anticipated progress, then we kind of need to go back to the drawing board and see what we need to adapt. Why is our intervention not working, and what changes do we need to implement? And we need to do that before we get to the next annual IP, when progress reports, when they come out and report out on progress and say that they didn't meet their IP goal or made limited progress towards their IP goal. So
Mhm.
I think those are some of the things I'd be looking for as a parent is, not just, identifying that they meet eligibility criteria, but why are they having such difficulty in math, and how is our intervention tied to our understanding of why they're having that difficulty.
So again, a logical link, right, between the intervention and what the breakdown is in processing. I
Yeah,
think that actually would roll well into intervention. And I know we kind of already talked about some of the questions we had laid out, so I want to kind of rearrange things just to preserve kind of the naturalistic flow. But
sure.
I think maybe if we can talk about interventions and then wrap up on like what the real world implications are and like why we
Sure.
shouldn't kind of dismiss math LD.
Yeah.
So yeah, building on that, like we want to make sure there's that logical link. Um, what are some of the hallmarks we're looking at? What are some of the programs that are commonly used for math intervention? Let's dive into what to do if this is your child's diagnosis.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation too, just talking about, the sort of explosion of information around dyslexia over the last 25 years, right? There's a lot of research-based, evidence-based programs, that are out there now for dyslexia. And I would say since 2017, districts have been widely adopting one or more of those programs to try to help support kids with dyslexia. There's much less out there in terms of math. The interventions aren't as well researched. There aren't as many programs that are being developed and studied. Um, so I do think it's helpful to kind of think about what some of the important components of effective math intervention are. Um, you know, I suppose this jumps ahead a little bit in terms of like real world implications, right? But I mean, when we have somebody that has a neurodevelopmental disability, right? Their performance, their learning rate and performance in that area is going to be impacted, right? There are some times, and I've seen it firsthand, where skills in an area have been remediated to such a degree that now maybe even they're functioning within the average range, right? So that's certainly possible, but it tends to be something that is impacting us to some degree, and we're going to have to develop some compensatory strategies as we move beyond K-12 education into college and work and the rest of our lives, right? But that doesn't mean that kids with dyscalculia can't learn math, right? They can, and it doesn't come from them laboring away at more math worksheets, right? Just simply exposing them to more math isn't gonna help, right? They're gonna need really direct and explicit instruction in math and in a way that's tailored to their unique learning profile. Right. And so, just like when we talk about with reading instruction, having this, explicit systematic instruction, it's taught very directly, it's taught in a particular scope and sequence. We need to be doing the same thing with math. When we started earlier about different, kind of quote unquote subtypes of math learning disability, individuals that have sort of lack that intuitive number sense, right? That understanding of quantity and distance and the relationships between numbers. We certainly have to make things, very explicit for them, right? And so one of the things you'll see in research-based or evidence-based math learning programs is this idea of like CRA, right? Concrete representational abstract, which means that we can't just present these constructs, these problems to them in the form of abstract numerical symbols, right? We have to make these things very explicit and very concrete. And oftentimes what that means are, using hands-on manipulatives and things that a child can, manipulate and rotate and put together and take apart to help represent those math concepts. From there we can move into things that are more pictorial, right? So, um, uh, you know, uh, graphs and charts and number lines and things like that, so they can see it. And then we're moving into representing those concepts in sort of abstract numerical symbols, right? So that concrete representational abstract sequence is really important in developing that underlying number sense. Because if a child's struggling with math because they lack that underlying number sense, and until we get that in place, we can't simply ask them to memorize facts and formulas because it's just not going to transfer. It's just not going to stick. Beyond that, a lot of programs, and one thing that you might hear people talk about is a program called Making Math Real, right? And so, they're the person who developed that program. My understanding is they passed away a few years ago, so they stopped doing the trainings on it. But there's a number of certainly specialized schools in our area, specialized schools for kids with dyslexia, for example, that have adopted Making Math Real because of the co-occurrence between learning disabilities and one of the that CRA principle is certainly a core component of that. Another thing that's built into those programs are different like mnemonics and other memory aids to aid individuals with their working memory and other executive functions. So not only do they sort of understand the math concept, but now they're able to remember and execute the procedures when they're performing math operations. Some kids are going to struggle with math in terms of their ability to retrieve math facts or the speed at which they're able to retrieve math facts. So for those individuals, the intervention should be targeting those skills. What I would also say with all of this too, though, is um, math like any skill, right? That there's a certainly a degree of kind of use it or lose it, right? There's also, I talked about earlier in terms of the kid's sense of competence and confidence when it comes to doing math. And if we're spending these, long blocks of time, working on math all in one session, it can become exhausting. And two, if those sessions are really spread out, it's not doing a whole lot in terms of their ability to consolidate that information in memory and be able to retrieve it efficiently. And so, even when we're thinking about like the components of effective math intervention, these are things that we need to be doing on a daily or near daily basis, and probably for shorter durations of time. Where kids can get that explicit instruction, get that immediate feedback, experience success, right, and kind of repeat the same thing the next day, versus having these marathon long math sessions where kids are just getting exhausted and losing confidence in their abilities.
hmm hmm And I think kind of bringing that back to, a lot of the population we work with, right? Parents with children in special ed are looking for, potential special ed support. Some of the questions I'm thinking of as you're describing these programs are, if math is going to be supported in a resource model, again, really asking questions of, okay, right, if we're looking to do this in like a push-in type environment, what is the feasibility or application of using a modified curriculum or supplementing with a
Yeah.
modified curriculum, like making math real? So I think I want to elevate that because that's one of the tension points I often see that doesn't always feel like it's the best thought out for math, where again, there may be pull out for like structured literacy for dyslexia, and then math is just, oh, mainstream math.
Yeah,
Um,
that automatically push in for that.
yeah, so I think that what you're saying, like, it is a good example of asking really intentional questions if math is compromised, of okay, how is it going to be supported in the classroom?
Yeah.
And are we doing like a daily resource pullout after the math lesson, before the math lesson, where we're pre-teaching? Are we looking more at pull out a couple times a week where we're doing a corresponding making math real lesson in anticipation of what's going to be taught?
Yeah.
Or is this, taught in a different classroom, a co-taught classroom at SVC? But do you have any advice or differing thoughts on kind of the special education
Yeah.
section of intervention?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up a lot with parents, right? Especially as we're sort of, if we do an independent educational evaluation, right? And we're, the assessment is complete and now we're headed into the IP meeting, like what do those services need to look at? And, you know, and, well, I mean, it's unfortunate for the kid, right? But that, schools oftentimes have, as much as these things are supposed to be individualized, they kind of have their, uh, the way they run their program,
Mhm.
and they sort of force the kid into that model, regardless of whether or not it's what's appropriate for the kid. So the way I think about it, and kind of curious what your thoughts are too, but when I think about whether or not to pull out or push in services, um, in my mind, anytime the content of the intervention deviates from what's going on in classroom instruction, you probably need to get pulled out to get that remedial instruction, right? Like if the content of what you're working on is different from what they're learning in the classroom, right? So and I think the real easy example of that is with reading, right? Like if you're a fourth grader struggling with word level reading, you're not gonna there's nothing they're doing in a fourth grade classroom that remotely has anything to do with learning word level reading, right? So you need to get pulled out in order to be able to do that. Um, and I think the same principle sort of applies to math, right? So, are there math skills within the instructional range of what's going on inside the classroom? Are the materials that are being used for the intervention similar enough to what's being done in the classroom that they could seamlessly do so? It is the instructional methodology that is required something that they could, reasonably implement, in the classroom. Oftentimes though, if they're struggling with whether it's reading, writing, or math, and they need a different set of materials. If the instructional approach differs from what's being done inside the classroom, or the level of instruction is just widely outside of what's being done in the classroom, then you're probably going to need to be pulled out. Now, again, if what the concepts that you're working on are closely aligned enough to the instruction that's going on inside the classroom, if the special education teacher can, seamlessly push in. I mean, initially when I remember when they pushed out like this whole like co-taught idea, like this was like 2005, at least in California. And the way the model was like presented was literally like two teachers teaching the classroom, right? And presenting the information in multiple different modalities in order to access different kids' learning styles. I mean, the way it was presented, you know, looked great. And I think, if it was ever implemented in that way, it could benefit a lot of kids. Unfortunately, what ends up happening in reality is the general education teacher provides the same instruction in the same way that they provide everybody else. There's a special education teacher, but oftentimes a special education assistant kind of sitting in the back of the classroom, maybe taking some notes. And then when instruction is complete and kids are working independently, then they kind of go around and check in with kids and see what they need help with, right?
Yeah.
Like if that's the case, that's not adapting the instruction at all, to somebody who may require a different type of instruction in order to be able to learn math.
hmm That's a whole other podcast topic, is kind of
Yeah,
also the research studies on inclusion that are frequently cited are actually not representative of the conditions that were in the research studies, right, in the real world.
right.
So the benefits of inclusion are often not applicable to how things actually work or look in the classroom. But like I said, that's another topic and altogether. But I like that illustrative example because what you described is what I think most of us see in 99% of classrooms. But I really like the questions you went through of, is it close enough aligned? Basically, how significant are the deficits in math, right? And I guess the way I'm thinking about it, in addition to the questions that you mentioned, and I want to extract those and write them out when we create an accompanying resource. But I think about it, I guess, from also two prongs. And one is this a level of difficulty where having a child sit through the general education lesson and then somebody coming in after, as you mentioned, realistically, right, an aide or a resource teacher, and provide a little extra support, right? Explaining something one more time, doing a couple more examples broken down. Some kids really do just need that extra
Yeah,
touch point and a couple other examples and an extra person to get clarification from, and then they're good in the gen ed setting. Or, like you said, is this something where we need significant levels of scaffolding and
yeah,
also all of those manipulatives and materials that may be very out of context and even
yeah,
not only not practical, but stigmatizing for a student if you're
for
pulling
sure.
out counting cubes and rods and, nobody else is doing that.
Right.
And I think that's the reality of some of these more intensive interventions is when you see the instructional materials, they're very multisensory and they can look very different than what peers are working on, particularly once you get into upper elementary, middle school, and, not even mentioning high school, right?
Yeah,
So I do like, again, like getting really specific and the way you were phrasing it of how is this going to be supported? How does this, address this aspect that we're talking about
right.
to make sure things are logical?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. And then I think ending on this, I mean, I think that our parents are always very much of the mindset of this stuff matters, right? Which is why we do the work that we do, and we work with families that are within the help seeking population that recognize, hey, this is getting in the way of quality of life, or might get in the way of quality of life, or educational attainment, jobs. But you kind of, just to hit this home, right, I wanted to end on why we do math intervention, because I think, as I mentioned at the onset, there is a tendency, I think, to minimize math more than other
Hmm.
subjects of, well, you don't have to take it in, in college, or even the
Yeah,
upper level math classes, at least where I went to school in New York for high school decades ago, you didn't have to go all the way through the math curriculum. Like you could
Yeah.
stop after I think it was like algebra 2 or something. You didn't have to go very far. You didn't have to do trig
Right.
and geometry. And I don't know how it is now, but so there was kind of this thing of like, if you're not a math, it was like a math person. If you're not a math person, that's fine. You don't never need to do it, right? You avoid it once you can, and that's just fine. And that's not really true, right?
Yeah.
Because, as we talked about earlier, math is so integrated into things. Just innately, right? Because you're going to have salary negotiations. You have to keep a budget, right? Like it
Mhm.
does show up, I think, in ways that, I don't always say insidious because that makes it seem so negative, but it's just so integrated. So, do you have other examples of kind of real world implications? And I also think about it from the lens again of like, how can we help parents advocate for their kids, right? Through kind of that programming, whether it be private intervention or school-based intervention of like why this matters.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's a really good question, right? Because this isn't just about how we perform in math classes in school, right? I mean, math is integrated into many aspects of everyday life. And kind of going back to what you were saying earlier too, I mean, I know a young woman that I'm working with currently, right, who um, in high school, has a significant math learning disability. And the school's perspective is as soon as she met like basic graduation requirements, they weren't obligated to provide any more help at all, right? That the IEP ended because she didn't have to take another math class, even though there was really still significant needs in this area, So I think it's certainly an important thing for parents to advocate and certainly integrate into a lot of aspects of everyday life. I mean, I jotted down a couple here. I mean, you mentioned some of them, right? But creating budgets, comparing and understanding mortgage rates, retirement investments. I mean, even things like cooking or estimating travel time, are related to math. If we're taking medication, dosing instructions, understanding statistics in the news. You mentioned negotiating salaries, understanding our taxes, comparing insurance plans. I mean, all of these things require mathematical abilities, long beyond, our second year of high school math, right? And, I mentioned earlier too, I mean, we're talking about a neurodevelopmental disability. That this may be an area where somebody, experiences challenges, certainly to some degree, for the rest of their lives. And so as adults, right, we're not taking math classes. We don't have an IEP anymore, and we're developing compensatory tools and help in order to help compensate for it, right? So,
Mhm.
very basic example, but we're using a calculator, right? We're using spreadsheets, we're using app reminders, things like that. For some of these functions, we have trusted advisors or loved ones who are assisting and taking over some of those functions for us, so we don't have to do it. So that we don't have to do it independently. And as adults, I mean, this doesn't mean that we're, less than or this is a weakness, right? We're developing real world adaptive living skills in order to be able to function. And many individuals with math learning disabilities are highly successful individuals in their chosen career paths, right? So it doesn't mean somebody, again, is not smart. And kind of going back to what I was saying before too. Uh, I mean, I feel like one of the most important goals for us as parents and as educators is for our kids to get through K-12 education and still feel like smart, capable individuals, right? Because the last thing we want then is to somebody to and then internalize this difficulty with math as somehow I'm not smart and I'm not capable, right? This is an individual that, and early assessment and identification of math learning disability and proper intervention is really important, in them getting through their K-12 education without graduating thinking I'm just not a smart, capable person, right? Helping them to understand how to use compensatory strategies in order to work around some of these math learning disabilities, is a really important component of that. But, in my mind, somebody graduating from high school, having a limited view of what they're capable of is far more damaging than whether or not they can automatically recall multiplication facts, right? And
Mhm.
so, we want to make sure that kids get to that point, that they have the compensatory tools in hand, know how to use them into college or into their careers and whatever their future life endeavors, might be. But yeah, math doesn't end by any means. Your second year of high school once you've completed your minimum graduation requirements.
Okay. No, I think that's a good place to end it. So thank you for all the information. And I know that this is a really interesting and again, underserved topic. So appreciate you sharing also your recent notes from all the work you've been doing in this space.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Love the conversation.